So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this SLA Europe event, which is Resilience and Being Kind to Yourself, which is kindly brought to us by Nikhil Damle. And we're so glad that you could join us. It promises to be a really fascinating and I think very useful presentation. Nikhil is a corporate professional, and he's got more than 20 years of multinational experience in banking and technology. And then he's also a cricket and a music lover, and he's a foodathon organizer, and he is based in Mumbai. Uh, Nikhil is a master practitioner in neuro-linguistic programming and a Gestalt certified associate. And he also teaches business management to rural entrepreneurs via the Tree Society, which aims to improve rural livelihoods in India. So I'm Carol Collier, and I sit on the SLA Europe Events Committee. So I'm happy to be able to host the event today. And just to give you, before I pass on to Nikhil, I just want to give you a couple of technical guidelines. So if you do have any troubles with the technology, please put questions in the chat. But then also, please do feel free to add any questions that you have for Nikhil in the questions area. And we'll save those up for the end, but we do have time set aside for the questions. So we would really encourage you to ask so we can engage in your concerns as well as what we're going to hear directly from Nikhil. So let me pass on to you now, Nikhil. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks, I think, for the opportunity to present, as part of SLA. I think one secret that I should probably share is at the beginning of my sort of, work experience, I've worked in what we might call special libraries, but I did not know that that concept existed before. So I used to be a business researcher at Morgan Stanley long time ago, and so I have a sort of understanding and connection with having heard of SLA back then at the beginning of my sort of work experience. So that's an interesting kind of spin to be able to present for people at SLA today. Yeah, I'm not going to sort of get into more of the profile because I think Carol has covered it, but it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to sort of talk to you about this subject. It's a pretty pertinent subject for our times that we are going through today, and I hope to be able to touch upon a few things that are related to resilience, but then what's the important link now more than ever to being kind to ourselves. So I'm going to explore a little bit of that, and then, like Carol mentioned, I'll try to leave around 15 minutes or so at the end where we can sort of take questions or hear what comments people have to say. So with that, let's get into this. Now, my mom was a school principal, and so one of the things that was a habit in the home was look up the dictionary. So I thought I'll kind of start with what does resilience and kindness mean, and interesting that I kind of looked it up. So resilience really had two ways. I looked at the Oxford Learner's Dictionary, and one is the ability of people or things to recover quickly, or as we sometimes say, bounce back from an unpleasant situation or from a setback. And the other one is referring to a ability of a substance to return to its usual shape after it's been bent or stretched or pressed. And it's interesting that sometimes we use these words to describe how we are feeling about being in a particular situation, that I'm really stretched right now, or I'm being pressed to my limits, or he looks like he's bent out of shape, could do with a break. So it was interesting that some of these words, which don't probably relate to a person, do get used a lot in describing situations of challenge. And then there was also a McKinsey definition of what resilience means, which is in the context of business, which is to be able to adapt, withstand, thrive and face shocks which are internal or external and known or unanticipated. So I thought in the context of COVID, in particularly, we've had some pandemics before, so it's known in a way, but not to the extent that it's happening now. So it's also sort of unanticipated in that sense. And then what was a surprise for me when I looked up the definition of kindness is, one is of course the second point, which is the act of showing that quality of being kind. But the other one, which was the more core meaning, was that it focused on other people, of how we are being generous, helpful, and caring to other people. So I thought it's a kind of maybe opportune way to get into this conversation, because it's also now time where we start looking at, how are we kind to ourselves, right? So turn the sort of, conventional meaning of kindness on its head, so to speak. So let's take a look at how things were prior to COVID. A typical day that would have, happened in any of our lives. And there was home, where we had things that we did with family. There was relaxing and spending time, watching television, or, hosting guests. And then there was a time where we would be in commute, on the way to work or on the way back. And, another set of sort of, different sort of boundary to workplace, where client meetings happened, hiring happened, or, day-to-day work that would usually be done in an office. And the key really to the time prior to COVID was that there are these boundaries, right? So the blue lines are clear boundaries. Uh, the commute almost for some of us has become like a buffer time, if I can use that word, where some of the activities from home are probably sort of, carrying over, maybe while we are driving, we're listening to podcasts, or someone might just catch up on an extra nap time, if they're on a bus on the way to work. Uh, but some of us also thought that, maybe let's kind of, check our email before we reach work. So this was like a buffer time, but there was clear boundaries, if you notice, between the place of work, the activities that were performed there, and also times of the day, right? So barring exceptional situations where someone might end up sitting at work longer, or other situations like that, the time of the day, the nature of work, all were sort of linked with the place where you were at, right? So these kind of boundaries existed prior to COVID. Now let's see what happens after this changed. And I thought best to kind of represent it visually, because there's lots that's gone on for different people. And the lady in the middle picture at the top, that became our sort of, sense of how we started dealing with things. There was work, there was finances, there was leisure, there was also, taking care of needs at home. Um, and also the interconnectedness in our times, where one region, I might be sitting in Mumbai working with someone in London or US. And so, that dynamic also kind of, came in. All of this now entered home. So the boundaries that we saw in the earlier slide were now not there anymore. It became one location where everything kind of had to be jammed in. And so we saw that our dining tables became our workstations. We had to start getting used to the idea of shared bandwidth, shared laptops, shared connectivity. At my home, when online schooling for my children started, we had to suddenly think of, hey, we need to invest in another internet connection, because in Mumbai, where I am from, when it rains, sometimes, the internet connection can go wobbly. So we certainly sort of started to think about things that were not usual for us. I was in fact once shushed by my own daughter when I was on a Zoom call, and she tapped me on my shoulder saying, "Dad, I need to answer a question to my school teacher." So we started also seeing how life is for our family members, when they were in school or when we are in office. And there was a merging of those things as well. um, Also, there were elder care duties that had to be performed. For some people, they became like a extra teacher at home, because once school got over, they had to take care of things with their kids as well. um, and typically what Mr. Tom Cruise would do, in an impossible mission in one of his movies, is what it started to look like except I think, Tom Cruise at least got the option of choosing and saying yes or no to that mission. I think we were pretty much, thrown into it straight away without an option to opt out. So let's see what it did to the paradigm of business resilience, because pre-COVID, where everything was centered around office building, office infrastructure, that place, we had high-speed internet, redundant networks, backup power, standardized IT equipment, um, business continuity plans and testing, and probably very little sort of, work from home situations. So a lot of things were employer dependent. They were taken care of by the companies, the organizations at the office buildings itself, and probably the employees had to show up, right? They took care of things before arriving at work, and then meeting rooms were there, infrastructure was set up. Probably in some cases there were cafeterias where they could go and have food, or gyms where they could go and do exercise. So those things were taken care of. After COVID, some of these things, went into a gray zone because variable internet speeds, like I said, at home, I really have to check before I get onto a call like this, which is my faster internet connection right now. There wasn't any kind of redundancy. I remember that um, the laptops in our home, there's one which is 2 years old, the other one which is 12 years old. I think it's still sturdy and reliable, but my kids think it's too slow, and we should change that out. And power backup, really, for our homes, last year in Mumbai we had a grid failure north of Mumbai, which had a cascading effect, and so for a better part of 6 to 8 hours, there was no power. I had my laptop on, but I had to kind of, be judicious about, how I was using it before it totally ran out of battery. So we were all dependent on different kinds of equipment, suddenly from nearly no work from home to switch to 100% work from home. And a lot of things now shifted from being employer dependent to employee dependent, in an organizational context. So which is the way, we say that that's a hard way of looking at it, because we're looking at infrastructure, we're looking at hardware, we're looking at network connectivity. And so we thought that, okay, maybe, let's kind of give people some things, that will make it easier for them to work from home. And perhaps, that should make it business as usual, right? Because if they're back online and they're able to function, I'm sure it must be normal, or they're sort of back to being where they are. But did it really function that way? Does it really mean that once the hard aspects are covered, does it really mean that can it be business as usual? Or why not? If not, why? So that brings us to something called personal resilience. And there's really a lot going on this slide, different colors, different fonts, um, which is really to indicate that it's not as cut and dry as it was earlier, where certain things would happen at home, certain things would happen at work. And now it was like, I would wake up in the morning, get on a call, but in between, I'd have to fix up breakfast, and then my son's school would start, or I would get a call saying, hey, there's an Amazon delivery, or someone would say, hey, my mother's been hospitalized, or there's been a death somewhere because of COVID. So a lot of these things started getting concentrated into one location, which is our home, and there's literally a collapse of schedules because of that, right? And what that did was, earlier, where we had a mental preparation that, hey, I'm leaving my home now, and the commute kind of gave us a buffer zone that, okay, I'm telling myself I'm getting ready for work. And then as you entered the office building, you were ready for work. You were in that mindset where, okay, meetings, client visits, hiring, all of this is going on. And again, in the evening when you left work and you got ready to get into the train or the bus or your drive back home, it was a signal that, hey, we are switching now again, get ready for getting back home. Whereas now there's mental switching happening like this without a lot of buffer zone. And it's just so frequent, right? Because you're in one moment you're a office colleague, in another moment you're a parent, in the next moment you might get a call from a friend, and then again you're back to sort of working on your business presentation or getting into meetings. So this whole switching mentally is what's kind of causing a lot of challenges in terms of people feeling drained out, people feeling fatigue, not knowing what's going on with them. Physically they're fine, but they're just kind of not jumping up with the same spring in the stride. So mental resilience, therefore, or personal resilience, really took on a sort of bigger role or an important role in terms of all of these things converging now. So what did the situation reveal for us? Definitely, that the view on business resilience is inadequate. It was adequate for the earlier reality where we were all working in buildings, but now we need to sort of update it. The myth of productivity that, oh, well, everyone's online. So great, they're able to put in longer hours, or, oh, they're not being able to put in adequate time. So the delinking of number of hours with how much work actually gets done, again, sort of, came into focus, and the need to shift to a more employee-centric way of working. Now this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone only works from home, but we need to take into account what's going on with people into the plans for the organization as well. And time is of the essence. So I can give you an example of friends I have in Bangalore, where it's notorious for its traffic, and people suddenly found that, hey, earlier when I was going to office, I used to spend 2 hours or 3 hours sometimes in commute. And so they found that there were more things that they were being able to think about of how they might want to use this time whenever things get back to regular working. So time uh, is something that people found as a rare commodity. Need for self-care emerged, both physical as well as mental. Empathy was one of the first and the most immediate things that came up, as people seeing that being aware of what's the situation that other people are going through, being aware of the different kinds of responsibilities that they might have in their personal lives, which wasn't apparent before, because our lives were so segmented and compartmentalized. And employee wellness doesn't remain a benefit anymore. It's almost become a necessity in India right now, where we have a lot of cases going on. Thankfully it's come down a little bit, but employers are now trying to make private provisions to get vaccine shots for their employees, because that's a necessity. If they're able to do that, maybe it'll make it easier for them, and put people's mind off whenever they decide to sort of open up offices and come back to work. And the last of it was also that now there's going to be more of short bursts of focused and intense work because of this mental switching and the whole locations kind of collapsing. So all the more personal resilience has become crucial, that we give it the attention it deserves for the success of any organization. Let's take a look at normal, because normal or new normal, this is something that's been mentioned a lot. Some people have used the term next normal, um, and I think in all of these the reference is really past based, right? That, oh, well, I used to be able to go out to cafes and malls and theaters before, or I used to be able to go to the gyms or the playgrounds before, or I used to be able to travel. And these are all relative to the current situation. They're all past based references, right? But I keep hearing this quote sometimes, where people say, oh, we're all in the same storm, but in different boats. And I think that captures how normal is different for all of us. If you look at any of these bullet points on the left, some people got, their marriages postponed. Somebody lost their job. Somebody had to shut their business. For all of them, normal is different, and it's an individual very unique sort of view of what normal is for me versus what normal is for you. And therefore each of us have a different starting point as to where we are in terms of defining what we can call normal for ourselves. And I think the graph over here is also indicative, because in the increasingly sort of global world, if I were probably in Israel or in New Zealand, where COVID cases are under control, or vaccinations have been 100%, versus if I'm in India, even in Mumbai versus Delhi, the reality of how restrictions are and what's opening up and what's not changes what my normal will be depending on where I am. So when we think of normal, then that's something that we need to take into account, that it's really going to be different for everyone. So one of the things that I came across when I was working on this was there was a study done by the ADP Research Institute in the US of US workers during the COVID-19 period, and it got published in 2020 September. And what it highlighted was that people, employees or workers who were infected by COVID-19 turned out to be more resilient and more engaged than other counterparts who were not infected. Now, conventionally, you might think that, hey, isn't it difficult? Isn't it a challenging time that they would have gone through, being infected by COVID? For sure. But I think what it also did is that of all the uncertainty that was surrounding us at that time, suddenly, with being infected with COVID or someone in the family being infected, um, there was a surety about what needed to be done. There was a clarity about what needed to be overcome. And so, having gone through that difficulty and come out of it, people ended up increasing their levels of resilience and therefore being more empathetic about what people go through situations like these. For the others, though, what happened is there's a prolonged wait for normalcy. It's almost like somebody's teasing you that, well, the race will be over if you run till here. And then as you near the finishing line is being moved up. So the wait for normalcy, whichever way we think it's normal, kept getting or is getting prolonged. And there's a constant uncertainty. Earlier it was about how many cases, restrictions, will travel happen, will it not happen, when will offices open. Now it's about, when will vaccines be available, how soon, which one is the one which is more effective. So all of this is constantly sort of adding. I'm not even mentioning the impact of news or social media here, because there's a constant sort of, thing happening with that. And I think the third thing is an ongoing amygdala hijack. Amygdala is the part of the brain which triggers our fight or flight or survival response. And so many things are kind of, emerging every day, that somebody who's not infected is getting another thing to focus on every day, and it's keeping them in a prolonged sort of cycle of uncertainty, lack of normalcy. And what's happening is resilience is taking a battering, because all of this, it takes a toll. Certainly mentally it takes a toll, and therefore people find it harder to be resilient in such times. So what's the link? Let's explore the link between kindness and resilience. And I'm going to go at it from right to left. So even though I've said, from the diagram flows from the left to right, really for us to be resilient, it's important that we're able to take actions and be open to making changes on the fly. Now, if that were to happen, we'd require a certain state of mind, which I'm calling it calm state of mind. And what that does for us is it opens us up for different kinds of perspectives, figuring out what's missing and being able to take actions. But again, that cannot happen unless there's a acceptance of how things are. If we've made mistakes, then sort of, calling those out and making sure that we're able to correct them. And again, that cannot happen unless there's a little bit of kindness or self-care or compassion, that's present for us. And there's another thing where, we take a bit of a long view of things. So a lot of times where we notice that there's lack of resilience is because we're so zoomed in that this is a crisis situation or this is a setback, that it doesn't allow us to distance ourselves and therefore take a more accepting and a kinder view of things. So therefore, how do we be more compassionate or caring or kind towards ourselves becomes a crucial part of whether we're going to be resilient and able to deal with different kinds of things that come in our way. So how do we calibrate this, right? I looked at state of mind earlier, and typically, these are instruments that we are familiar with, whether it's an oxygen level or whether it's your temperature, uh, you have instruments with which you can measure that, and therefore then you can address it and take action. But for a state of mind or for what we are going through as emotions, there isn't any quick self-check kit that's available. And therefore, focusing on what is it that's going on with ourselves becomes even more important, because if that emotion or feeling or what is it that we're thinking about ourselves right now, if that's not known, and that can easily get clouded because there's this flurry of things going on, everything that's collapsed and going on simultaneously, it's easy to get sucked into that, and therefore it becomes more important to keep a check of how do I find out where I'm at right now. Am I feeling annoyed about this? What's making me angry? Why am I worried right now? These kind of things are things which can help us bring the focus back on where we are at with respect to our frame of mind. So let's take a look at what can we do to calibrate where we are. uh, I'm going to, being an NLP trainer, I'm going to take you through some simple things and techniques that we might find useful. So the frame we are in gives us the flavor to our response and eventually the outcomes. I wear these glasses, and if I take them off, my vision will be blurred. But instead, if I wore pink colored glasses or blue colored glasses, that would color the way I would see things. And in the US, I think there was a study which was done where for 3 months they got people to wear different colored glasses, and when they were taken off, they were still seeing those colors even though that color actually was not there. So the frame from which we look at things can really shape the outcomes that happen in our lives. And so a reframe is a way to change the flavor, or everything else that follows. In a way, it's also a means to look at the more useful side of things in life, right? Because the way we are looking at it is probably one way of seeing it, not the only way of seeing it. So I've put up some examples here, and really what's there on the left is different kinds of things that you might notice happen on a day-to-day basis. So first one could be that your boss calls up on your mobile phone at home once you've logged off from work, maybe just a few minutes ago. And what could happen? Maybe there could be some bit of annoyance, maybe there could be some irritation, maybe there could be worry, right? That what's going on, why is it that there is this call right now? But if we're able to sort of pay attention to this and check this and notice that, okay, hang on, this is what's going on with me right now, what else could be there, right? And a possible reframe could be, maybe there's something so important that my boss could not wait but to call me up now, and so maybe I could be helpful, maybe I could be supportive. Now notice that being annoyed or being irritated in that situation would color your response, would kind of give you a different kind of a response. It would end up being a different, slightly different conversation than if you were in a supportive frame of mind when you answered the phone. And that would mean that it would be a totally different kind of a conversation. Maybe while you're working from home, your 2-year-old spills coffee, and this has happened to me right next to me. My son isn't 2 year old, but he's pretty playful, and sometimes things happen, and water got spilled over, and the immediate reaction could be, oh my gosh, do I really need this now? I'm so in the middle of my work, and why does this have to happen? So it could be a wary response, it could be a sense of being tired, that again I have to take care of something. And that would mean that the next set of actions or responses would go a certain way. But if I pause there and I said that, hang on, this is exactly how clumsy I used to be when I was a kid, then it brings in a little bit of lightness, it brings a little bit of playfulness, diffuses the whole situation, takes the sting out of it. And even though coffee might be spilt over, I might still sort of laugh a little bit at it and keep going at it, and my afternoon might still turn out to be nice and not so bad. So reframe is really allowing us to shape the way our responses can be to things that are happening out there. And it also allows us to check and stop and calibrate. What is it that's our likely state of mind when this thing happens, or when a particular situation comes up? I'm not going to go through all of them, but essentially, the key thing to remember is the frame then gives us the perception, gives us meaning, more importantly, gives us a particular state of mind, and then that determines the response or the outcomes. Uh, so I'm going to take you through one more thing, which is very useful in terms of checking what frame of mind is, or where we stand or calibrating ourselves, which is called meta programs. Again, this is from neuro-linguistic programming. But in a very simple way, meta programs are filters that we automatically have, that all of us have, and they help us make sense of the world. They help us decide things. They help us in processing information. And if we're able to catch on to these meta programs, then it helps us understand what our orientation is. It helps us understand what's going on inside the inner world, and it reveals how we think, how we act. And when that happens, there's a possibility that we may be able to tailor our response slightly. So these are common ones, but they're not all, but I thought they're kind of relevant to use here. So first kind of a filter or a orientation is towards and away. And towards, these are things that you will typically find when people speak. So a towards kind of a response. Now let's say with something like this, what I'm doing right now is I want to make sure that I deliver a good presentation and all the people who attend really take value out of it. And away kind of response would be, I want to make sure that I don't mess up and I finish on time, and I don't want to be the one that's kind of keeping people waiting because I'm running over. So that would be in language. That's the way I would state what is it that I'm trying to do. So it's an outcome oriented filter or an orientation. And the thing to look at this is how we language ourselves in response to things. So when COVID happened, what did we say? Right? Did we say, oh my God, this did not have to happen? Or how am I going to make sure that my health is taken care of? Right? There's a subtle difference. It's like saying the difference between I don't want to be sad versus I want to be happy. I want to travel and see the world versus I don't want to be infected by COVID. Subtle differences, but it's something that can crop up in the way we speak. Matching and mismatching is almost like saying looking for similarity and dissimilarity. And sometimes this can come up as a confirmation. So when we hear someone else say something and we identify with that, we would say something which is like a matching orientation. Yeah, that's exactly how my daughter responds when I ask her about homework or studies, right? So you're being able to connect with someone, or you're being able to include someone in your experience. Mismatching is almost like sort of leaving something out, right? So, oh, that's not the way we do things over here. Or he asked everyone else for tea but not us, right? So that's a language where it's a language of exclusion. It's a language where things get left out. Now this can also be useful because you could when my neighbor had COVID, we use this kind of a language to say that, well, it's happened to them, but maybe it may not happen to us. So it's not that the left or the right side is negative or positive or desirable or undesirable, but it's important to realize that it's a spectrum. And if you're able to notice where you're on the spectrum, you'll be able to make out whether this is the appropriate way for me to be over here right now. um, Next one is external and internal, which is really to say, if I did some good work and I asked someone, what would make you think that you've done good work? An external oriented person would say, well, if my boss comes over and pats me on the back, then I think I've done a good job. Whereas an internal oriented person would say, I think I've put in the effort, and therefore I think it'll turn out fine. And you'll see a lot of these kind of responses coming up from sports people, where they're very internal process oriented, irrespective of whether there's been a loss or a win. They're very internal focused in terms of how they go about doing things. Another one is a big chunk and small chunk, which is really, you can think of it as big picture, small picture. And again, in our context right now, there's a balance needed for both, right? You need to be small chunk enough to focus on what you need to do today, but you need to have a healthy big chunk focus to say that, hey, hang on, there is this crisis, this difficulty, this challenge that we're going through is going to pass through, and we will get to sort of better times when the pandemic is over. So again, start noticing where is the focus in terms of the language that we speak. And the last one I think is very important, especially in the context of kindness, self and others. You might have noticed sometimes, earlier when probably we were all visiting, traveling, at a breakfast buffet, I've seen this happen a lot, where there's that last Danish pastry and two people come and one says, no, please, you take it. and that's somebody who's an others orientation, right? So what is there for others is more important to them than self. A self-oriented person would say, okay, fine, I'll do what's right for me. Now again, there's no good or bad in this, but especially now when we're thinking of self-care, when we're thinking of kindness to ourselves, if you are someone who's highly others oriented, then you might want to check whether you need to swing it around a little bit and be a little bit more self oriented. It's not self-centered, it's not selfish, but it's just saying that where is my attention. um, if an accident happened, some people would drive by, some people would get down and help others, right? So that's a natural response that can happen depending on the situation. But keeping the broader context in mind, can we be more self-oriented right now than others oriented? As they say in airlines, right? Wear your own oxygen mask before helping the others. That's a classic example of a self-orientation that is encouraged for safety. The other thing that is there is a third space. So no matter what kind of situations we find ourselves in, there's always two aspects to anything. If I'm working out, it's about what I'm doing for myself as well as the activity of working out. If I'm in a marriage, it's an understanding between me and my wife. If I'm at a workplace, it's what goes on between my manager and myself, or me and my team. So third space is a concept which allows us to expand our sense of identity. And again, why this is relevant now is because there can be a tendency to kind of, shrink into our shell, or be sort of, a little bit worried about what's happening only with us. So this also allows us to enrich our selves by, adding new dimensions. But more importantly, it allows us to dissociate from singular ways of identifying ourselves. So I've met people and they say, yeah, I'm a doctor or I'm a lawyer, but they're not only a doctor. I'm sure there's more aspects to life. So looking at it from a third space perspective, that I'm doing this, but what could be a third space in this? I'm an uncle and I have a niece, but hey, how about she teaches me something new which I don't know in technology or in social media? So the third space really allows us to, in a way, step back or create a little bit of distance from what we're doing, and therefore then add a little bit more meaning, or allow us to invest in our own well-being. Okay, I think some of you might be familiar with this. It's an experiment. It's a famous YouTube video. You'll see the link. But this professor comes into the class. There's a plastic jar, and initially he puts the golf balls in, says, is the jar empty? Everyone says no. Yes, it is quite full right now. Then he brings in some pebbles, puts the pebbles in, and says, now do you think there's any room, or is it full? And they say, yeah, it's full. Then he adds some sand, and in the end, some beer. So the meaning really out of this is, our golf balls are the most important things that are there in our life, right? So these are things like our own health, our passions, our family, and our friends. The pebbles are things which are secondary, then job, car, home. Sand is everything else that's kind of out there. Um, so this is a good time for us to reassess and reset things. Is there certain golf balls which might not have been in the jar of life before? And certainly, our own mental well-being is one of those things to think of. Is that something that was not there in the jar of life before, and is it worth putting back in? The beer really is that, if all of these things are there, there's always some time to have fun, if you have someone like that. But it certainly wouldn't work if your jar of life was filled with pebbles and sand, and then therefore had very little room for golf balls to go in. So it's a time to reassess for ourselves and reset and check whether, put all of this, empty the jar in a tray, and start picking out what are the important golf balls in our life, so that they go back in the jar. So, not in conclusion, because this is still a continued situation, and in a way of looking at it, if we did not have the pandemic, probably some of these challenges, some of the concerns, the importance of mental health, would not be up at the forefront. So I think I prefer to see it as a continuation. It's still not where it is, it needs to be, but therefore, it needs to continue on this path where we've started questioning and looking at things. So it's important we pay attention to our language and thoughts, accept our vulnerabilities. So acceptance is key. Check check the frame that we are in right now, and then see if we can reframe. Look for that third space in everything that we do, so that we expand on the dimensions of who we are. And then take care of the golf balls, right? Just check, reassess, and reset. What are the golf balls that are there? And also really look at things as that the normal is now, not what it was before, or not how it might be in the future, but today, now. When it's raining in Mumbai, and I'm presenting to you, this is normal now, and this is the way it has to be. So just bringing the focus into that, so that we're taking care of ourselves. Okay. I think you might be familiar, Roland Garros, both of these champions pulled out for different reasons, one for her own mental well-being, the other for his personal physical well-being. And the question is, um, both chose getting out of the tournament for something that is so dear to them, for something that they love doing. And the message really in this is that if they can get out of doing these things, uh, to care for themselves, it's probably, so that it prolongs them being able to do what they love. Why can't we? I was coaching someone last week, and this person had just had a COVID shot and was feeling the after effects. And I asked that, did you take some time off for yourself? And she said, no, I can't afford to do that right now, because there's a go live of a project, and my client wouldn't like it. So being able to sort of put ourselves ahead of everything else, especially when it comes to our well-being, is important. And therefore we have to be the champion of our own well-being. No one else can on our behalf. So that's really what I want to leave you with. And I'll pause now for any questions or comments. uh, Carol, back to you.
Hi, thank you. We do have some questions. Oops, go ahead.
Excellent. No, I just thought I'll sort of leave this information on there as well. So this is the sort of thing where you get to know where I am at. But yes, let's go to the questions.
Okay, and let me say that if anybody has more questions, please do put them into the question area. So the first question that we have is really coming pretty directly off the last point that you made,
Mm-hmm.
which is the person wrote that there's been layoffs at the company where they work during
Mm-hmm.
COVID. And so they say, I don't want my manager thinking I'm a slacker if I take
Mm-hmm.
personal time off. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so how do I address my needs without impacting my performance ratings?
Mm-hmm. And I had actually one more anecdote yesterday. This friend of mine, and she's been pretty battered because of COVID right now. Uh, Hectic, sort of very intense client facing role, so has to be on calls at all hours of the day, and so cannot be seen sort of slacking, like you said, or cannot be seen not being available, right? So it's almost like a 24/7 situation. And in a span of a month, there's been 4 deaths in the family. And yesterday, I got a message saying that, hey, my nephew passed away right when he was in my arms and collapsed. uh, and this friend of mine, I've been speaking for some time, saying, you need to take time off, you need to take time off. uh, Last, I think, one that she took was about 2 years ago. um, so where does the responsibility lie, right? Because we can't really say that employers are bad, or managers are wrong, or it's an exploitative kind of situation. But I think if we're not sort of being upfront about our own situation, and which brings us back to personal resilience, because maybe you were able to make these arrangements in a normal time, maybe there was medical support available in normal times. These are not those kind of situations that we're used to. And if you're the only one who's left with taking care of things at home, And they may not be as extreme as what I mentioned, what happened with my friend, but they could be as easy as, helping out at home, or there's some extra time where you may need to teach your kid maths, or brush up on English. um, but those are crucial things that need your attention and that time, and there's no way that your clients, or there's no way that your manager or your team are going to know about it unless you voice it out. So I think that's where the crucial thing is of, if you're too others oriented, you might think that, hey, hang on, my company will feel like I'm letting them down, or my manager might think that I'm a slacker. But that's the time where you need to probably pull the reins back a little bit and say, hang on, uh, I need to take care of myself, and I need to, address these things. Otherwise no one else will, and things will fall apart, and it could get worse than it is now. So I think uh, it's a question of not so much of courage, but just making that first step. Sometimes people are uncomfortable speaking it, and I encourage them to send an email, because email may seem less confrontational, not that direct, and you could just say that, hey, there's a lot going on, Mr. Manager, and I'd like to take some time off. And it can be as simple and diffused as that, if you feel like you don't want to be confrontational about it. Um, but I think you also cannot overestimate or underestimate the other side. I think generally, if you're open and vocal about your situation, uh, people will people will take that into consideration. And I think performance is something, which is relative, because today you took a day off, it doesn't mean that somebody is keeping a book where they have a black mark against your name. If you're a solid performer, you'll continue doing that, and I'm sure no one will have challenges, letting you take care of things on your own.
Thank you. Um, Another question is related. I think all the questions that I've had so far are kind of related, which makes sense. That this person writes, I'm a working professional and I'm a caregiver and I'm a parent. So
Hmm.
how do I find time for myself when there is no time left from all my other responsibilities?
Right. And I think what's also probably implicit in that question is a concern, or the way I see it is that that's what probably was always there, that they were probably caring for someone at home, maybe elder, or maybe someone who's sick. They, it's not that because of COVID they're now suddenly a parent, but probably these things were under the surface somewhere, and now they've sort of come up, and we're having to deal with it. So it is like that situation that I mentioned, that it's probably a golf ball which was not there in our radar before, but has now come up, and maybe it means that we have to reorganize things that way. Because these golf balls, if we're not taking this opportunity to take a look at what are those important things in our life, then we're again not going, like they say, right, never waste a good crisis. So this has got to be the positive side of it, that we take a look at, oh wow, I didn't realize these were the other things that happen at home, and therefore I need to give that more attention and balance things out in terms of the imbalance that might have been there. So I was watching this movie about the wisdom of trauma just before this, in the morning, and one of the things that was mentioned there was, maybe our idea was of normal was actually something that was very unrealistic and stretched out, that we were trying to hold on to. And now, where the pandemic has sort of equalized, or put everyone in the same situation, it's an opportunity for us to question where our focus needs to be, where our attention needs to be, and some of these things which are probably under the surface are now becoming more visible and clear. So there's no easy answer to it, but then what would you do? You wouldn't be able to leave alone your caregiving responsibilities, or you wouldn't be able to tell your children that, hang on, I'm working for an office that expects me to be online all the time. So those are needs that we now need to incorporate in our life, and therefore then we need to start seeing work also as a part of life. Maybe our view of things was a little bit disproportionate before.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Um, so the next question I have is kind of long. Um, so the person wrote that they were struck by what you said about the study in the US about the people who actually got infected being more resilient than those
Mm-hmm.
who were sort of left in the state of uncertainty. And
Mm-hmm.
so they ask, do you have advice for someone who's been thrust by the pandemic into a state of crisis due to a family member's mental health crisis, where
Mm-hmm.
the resolution and the timeline is not at all clear, or it's not at all
Mm-hmm.
certain? And so they're wondering if you have
Right.
any advice just in any way, but in particular in being able to focus at work.
Right. Um, I think there's one or two things over here. One of it is obviously, probably sort of work orientation, right? That people want to focus on work, but obviously when there's something niggling going on at home, that's something that needs attention. Particularly, if it's someone in our family, and we're seeing that there might be some concerns or some signs that we're noticing that maybe it's taking a toll on them. Um, I think speaking to people is key. My wife is a homemaker, and I proudly say that everything that I'm able to do, it's because there's a rock solid foundation and support that's available at home. And suddenly, when we were all at home, we realized that this is not a usual situation for her, because my kids would be at school, I would be away at work. So she had a bit of me time before that, and almost immediately we sort of spoke, and she said, well, it's getting too much, you're all of you are hungry all the time, and I'm having to kind of look after you, what about me? And so we kind of came up with some ways that we would ease things for her, and we would absolutely not let her do anything on certain days, almost thinking of it as, if that's a 5-day job, then you would also want to make sure that people step away from the intensity of things at time. But I think if we had not spoken about it, it would have festered, carried on, and at some point of time, it would have resulted in a blowout, or an explosion of emotions. So I think to that kind of a question, I would say that checking in on each other, whether it is your work colleagues or whether it is people at home, checking in and communicating with them is important. And when I say communicating, sometimes it's just about listening. uh, my son is 9 years old, and I do a small game with him. I write these questions for him, uh, which have a few loaded questions, but I'm trying to understand what he's thinking about. And the thing that he always writes off, what will you do after the lockdown and everything is over? And the first thing he says, go to school and meet my friends. uh, and we talk about it, that one of the things that came up when I was speaking with him was, he felt like there is still more time that we should spend together as a family. So as a family, we spoke, and we said, okay, we'll cut down on the TV time and we'll play board games. So nowadays we're playing Monopoly, or we're playing Scrabble. But if that had not happened, the speaking and the listening had not happened, then he would have probably just continued trying to internalize that and just cope with it, right? And that's not good, to just keep these kind of things bottled up in there. So I would say definitely reaching out, uh, talking to people, asking how they are, and just lending a patient ear, because sometimes things come up which you don't know might be there. And I think the resolution of it, it's just about looking at it day by day, because some of these situations are more tough than we think it is. It cannot be as instantaneous as we might want it to, and therefore it has to be sort of done one step at a time.
Okay, thank you. Um, that is really interesting. I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions, really. I just want to put my SLA Europe hat on again. But before I do, I really want to thank you, Nikhil, for a fascinating presentation. And I think that we all have, nice concrete tips to take away to hopefully, use
And
in our
thank
lives during this time, which, as you said, is continuing, so not concluding as fast as we'd like. I really do
and,
appreciate
and
it.
And thanks so much for the opportunity. And I think, picking this subject, which is very relevant, and helping me set up with this whole system of how we went about it. So really thank you for helping me out with this, and I'm glad I got a chance to share this with people.
Thank you.